And welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this summer edition of our Learning Acceleration Collaborative. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. There we go. And we have some special guests with us today that are going to speak to us. Get over here. There's a note catcher. Let me get a copy of that. It's on our hub, but I will go ahead and add it to the chat so you'll have that. Get the chat open. There we go. If you'll please sign in, let us know who's here today. And oops, we have Lisa Sireno who's going to speak to us, and Debra Yonke. And they're going to talk about kind of carrying on what we spoke about last time, the summer program initiative that we had going on, and then some other DESE initiatives. And then we'll have some time for question and answer when we're finished. We're going to try to start and end on time, and no really time limit today. So I don't know that it'll take us a long time. Being summer, I want to respect your time. You're welcome, since we're a small group, just to unmute and ask a question if one comes up. And as I said, we are recording this and everything will be available when we're finished. And go on to the next. Of course, our community agreements, they're the same. And I saw this on a school's marquee, and I thought this could be our quote for today. It says, "Don't blame, take aim." I thought that was very appropriate. So we need to take aim at what comes next. And then, as always, our goal is to build on the current recommendations that we have for reaching all students and accelerating learning. Discussion of equity, meeting the needs of the most vulnerable, economically challenged, students in primary grades, and responses to social emotional needs of our students and educators. There we go. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Lisa and Debbie and let them let us know what's going on. Oh, and I'll edit that. John, let me know that the document needs edited, so I'll fix that so everyone has access.
Great. So I'll go ahead and jump in with a quick introduction, and then Lisa can jump in. But I'm Debra Yonke from Republic Schools, and I just had the opportunity to be involved at the front end last year on the task force, and then also part of the national convening on summer school and enrichment. And recently, Lisa and I were invited by Phyllis Barks, who was also part of that work, to share some information at the Missouri School Board Association tomorrow. So it's wonderful that we can share it with you today and get your lenses on the work. So happy to be a part and to be with you this morning.
And thank you, Debbie, for joining the group, and just to kind of let this group know some of what we're going to talk about really is going to recap some of the information in some ways that sort of founded this group last summer. So we're also going to, I think at the end, ask you first of all, as we go through this presentation, to consider that we're going to be talking to those school board members tomorrow. That's going to be our audience, and we would love to hear from you recommendations for what you think they should hear on the topic. And we've positioned this as not just summer learning, but learning in the post-COVID era. So kind of keep those things in mind as we move forward.
I'd like to walk through, we'll kind of shorten some of the participation pieces because we'll be meeting in person with them tomorrow. But just as we start, to have you think back from last spring, think of last March to where we are now. And if you just come off of mute and share what word or words stand out to you as you think of this season that we've been in.
Perseverance.
Heroes.
Oh, yeah.
You said resilience, right? So it's so interesting as we think of these words and think about the positive framing that you're giving. There's vulnerability, all of those pieces, and thinking where we started this journey. So if you go to the next slide, what we realized is last March, our brains were spinning. We were trying to think of where to next. How are our students and our families? What procedures do we need to quickly put into place to make sure everyone's safe and taken care of? I mean, at the classroom and the district level, we were like, can we do this? Can we teach virtually? What about those kiddos, those vulnerable populations that we might not be able to reach? And it was really on our mind, everything from budgets to operations to academics, to shifting where we are now. And these ideas of we can persevere. There are heroes every day in our midst that have just risen to the occasion and just done that with vulnerability and empathy. So all those key words that you're capturing there. So as we think about this, our goal today, which is on the next slide, is just to take this opportunity to share some resources that have been collaboratively developed this past year. And I know a lot of you were involved in that work. So tomorrow we want to share these resources and kind of an update, if you will, with Missouri School Board Association and what's been done behind the scenes to address the academic needs of all of our students. All right, so Lisa, did you want to jump in here?
Lisa, you're on mute.
Apologies, technical difficulties or operator error or a combination of the two. So to think back on what was going on, to reflect back, it seems like it's been much longer than that, those 14 months, 15 months ago, when COVID-19 caused those school closures in the spring of 20. And at that point, DESE began to pull together resources around teaching and learning and supporting that transition to how to support or how to convert lessons and content and reach students when they weren't in school buildings. We reached out across the state and asked for volunteers and to put together this task force for learning acceleration, and these 3 work groups began their work in May. And over a relatively short period of time, that task force really dug into their topics, as many of you know, and came out with recommendations for DESE, but also for our LEAs and our local communities. And if we move to the next slide, we have a recap of those 3 work groups that really, and the goal of each work group. We had one group that really wanted to provide recommendations for assessing the impact of the pandemic in that spring, recommendations for accelerating learning, focusing on the coming year and beyond. And then an overarching goal, what it turned out to be an overarching goal, was really recommendations and tools for reaching all of our students. We can move on to the next slide, which will show us just the groups that were represented among the members of the task force. So over 119 individuals came together And they really gave so generously of their time and their expertise. They spent time in meetings with us that we facilitated, and spent a great deal of time then collaborating outside of our formal meetings to create resources and tools, and put materials out to districts, things that are on the hub for districts to use. And I'm just amazed and so humbled every time I think of that expertise and how unselfishly this group of folks came together in a time when they had so many other things, other demands on their time they were trying to figure out in their schools. And I'm sure we all had those challenges in our personal lives too, of adjusting to the pandemic and the conditions. Our next slide, if you want to go back and revisit some of those materials and see the resources and the explicit list of recommendations, get to the hub, the recommendations for DESE, the recommendations for LEAs, you can find them on our website. We've got the link here.
So as we think of that, this will be a lot of new learning for our audience tomorrow. So letting them know, absolutely linking all the web pages and resources back, but then giving some synopsis of what the task force recommended. And many of you are familiar with this, but really it's this idea of how do we collect resources and also remind everyone that we've got to care for the whole student, that the task force placed a high priority on attending not only to the academic needs, but the social and emotional needs of our students and our educators, and focusing, as Lisa said, on our at-risk or most vulnerable students. So 3 key areas were just that reminder to be sensitive to the impact on trauma. We had some families that were like, this is so good, it's family bonding time, we finally get a chance to slow down and be together, while others, it was a very high stress time for them. And then just the reminder to remain flexible. This was uncharted territory for so many of us, and I would say for all of us throughout the state. And the key is making sure that we're think outside the box and consider the possibilities as we moved forward. And then also this idea that equity isn't the same as equality. And we have to ensure that all of our students have access to high quality education as we think of moving forward. So in addition, the task force came up with recommendations for the districts throughout the state. And these you'll see reflective of those 3 task groups, that task force groups themselves, that definitely remembering we've got to determine students' needs through assessment. It wasn't as simple as saying, okay, in February, the student was in 3rd grade, so we're going to start them right back in 4th grade. It wasn't as easy as saying, let's just jump in straight into 4th grade. We needed to have some resources and the understanding that we had to find out where all of our students were currently in their academics. And then this idea of accelerating student learning to match the student needs. And I will be honest, I learned so much as part of that task force, because think pre-COVID, acceleration in our minds was typically delegated to those advanced students or those students who, may need more enrichment or extensions. Where with this, when we're talking about acceleration, it's this idea of moving forward. How do we ensure that our students move forward, but definitely having to differentiate for the different mini needs that our students have? LEAs were also encouraged to create a communication plan. What's it going to look like for curriculum and instruction as we head back into this school year? And then to develop flexible and alternative scheduling and staffing models. There again, it's this idea of what we've done in the past may not work. And I really think for a lot of us, it was like, okay, how can we leverage the time we have within the school day to best meet the needs of our students, while at the same time thinking outside the traditional school day and resources we could have. The other recommendation was to support the physical and social emotional needs of students and their families and the educators. we saw a big shift of as teachers and leaders, our hearts go to the children and their families. But then we realized that we needed to be taking care of ourselves and making sure that the teachers in the classroom and our leaders in the buildings were taken care of as well. So what might that look like for the districts? And then making inclusion, equity, and excellence a priority to be able to move beyond our circumstances to meet the needs of the students. So as we got into that, this whole idea opened up this big box of understanding around acceleration of learning. So I'm going to give you a minute just to read that slide.
Debbie, can I take a second and chime in? I feel it'd be remiss to not point out, each of those three groups, and I know I talked to Cammie about this early on when those recommendations were shared out and published. The biggest recommendation was to cancel state testing. That came from all three groups and was, in my opinion, the most resounding agreement of everybody was that needed to happen. And that recommendation got buried. When you look at the recommendations that are published on the DESE website, that is like hidden, and again, I get that the powers that be and political pressure, there was a reason to have assessment, and I'm not trying to debate that or bring that whole debate back up, but when we talk about trying to support the social emotional of not only the students but also the staff and the districts and the administrators and things, there were a lot of districts in our state who still were struggling with getting kids in and how we were even going to make this happen. I don't know. I think our results overall statewide have been pretty good as far as getting the kids to come back into the building to test. And that's to be commended and celebrated that we were able to pull that off. But again, I would say that went the way that happened put a lot of undue stress on a lot of people. And, again, that recommendation just kind of, the one that I think all three groups were, so in tune with was the one that kind of wasn't mentioned. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, I'll leave it at that. I'm not trying to gripe. We had no problem. We were in session most of the year. We had a few stints where we had to shut down due to breakouts, mainly if it hit too many staff members where we just couldn't, either we didn't have enough bus drivers or we didn't have enough teachers and subs to cover. But they were short stints, so, but I don't know. I just felt like I should say something.
Yeah. And John, thank you for saying that. Carrie, would you mind going back just one slide?
Sure.
So John, where my thinking is, and Lisa, feel free to jump in, is when we talk about that determining student needs through assessment, I think that might resonate with some of the school board members as well on that point, and that there'll be, some of them I'm sure had conversations in district about that as well, and how to navigate what that looked like. So I appreciate you bringing that up. And Lisa, anything you would add?
Yeah, I agree, John. And I would say that it was certainly not our intention to bury that recommendation. So if that were the appearance, let me apologize for that. And as we went through all of the recommendations, so we had a total of 80 some, and you're right, that one would be a very striking one. The recommendation that came forward was remove the accountability from the statewide assessments and make the decision and let people know by the 1st of August. So before school started. I think that was if I'm recalling, I don't have the document in front of me, but if I'm recalling, that was the recommendation that came forward. So we ultimately did that, but the State Board of Education had to take that action. And they ultimately did that in December. So not at the beginning of the school year, but in December. So
And I'll say
Yeah.
I'm familiar with how it all transpired
Yeah.
and stuff, but if I recollect correctly, that the assessing of student learning, it was more through formative assessment and internal things, not state testing. But
correct.
again, I'm not trying to get into a debate. It is what it is. We've already done it, but I do feel like of all the people that were involved in stuff, that was the biggest thing, and that didn't fit the narrative of what we wanted to be the case. And when I say that, I mean, I think whether that's coming from political side, commissioners feeling, the state board, whatever, I get that. But that was, and maybe I'm off target, but I felt
I'd say you bring up a fair point, and it's important in the way that we communicate when we look back. So I would thank you for that. And I, for one, will kind of make some adjustments in the way that I talk about this as we move forward.
Yeah. And once again, thank you for saying that. So as we
Yeah.
go through, that type of information is helpful because
Yeah.
there's a good chance we'll get those questions tomorrow as well. And so I appreciate that, John. So as we look at this learning acceleration, since most of you were heavily involved in the work, this isn't new to you, but we're thinking it may be new to a lot of our audience tomorrow with this understanding of how acceleration is really moving our students forward, and this idea that they've got to keep going with their on-grade level standards while receiving this essential scaffolding. And I think my aha moment it wasn't that we're going to disregard that there was learning loss, but we were going to be very strategic in where that learning loss was addressed, to partner it with timely interventions to move them forward on the skills that they needed. So really looking at that, the view of learning loss differently than we had in the past. So on the next slide, if you would, Cami, is really, we're going to take a little bit of time here to hand this slide out to the participants tomorrow and have them really look at the difference. What are we talking about when we talk about acceleration versus remediation? And this idea, our goal with acceleration is removing those barriers, what's going to hang up our students, especially the students who need the most assistance from us. So I'm going to give you a minute to read over that. Okay, and if anybody wants to come off of mute, the next slide is really just processing this, taking some time to talk about how, if we're asked, how would we explain this difference between remediation and acceleration to others?
Well, I think your slide does a pretty good comparison of how I think people typically view it. The idea of acceleration, the key point is introducing those necessary skills just prior to teaching that lesson. And I think our most talented teachers have always been good at that, and that's why they're so talented, is because when they have a student, they refresh and kind of double check to make sure everybody still kind of understands a topic. And as a math teacher, it might be something that they haven't really worked with for a while, so you kind of pull out a few problems and see who's getting it, who's not, and if you need to spend a little bit of time reteaching that, you do that, and if not, you can move on. But you can't just assume everybody knows all those prerequisites, knowing that we've missed some of the stuff. So I think that's a pretty good slide.
Thank you. Anyone else?
So when I look at that slide, I don't disagree. I really think it does show the difference. I do, however, on that last block for remediation, I know that from my experiences, I see teachers working on some areas of remediation. I think that the goal definitely is to catch up with peers. But the whole idea that it's passive, I'm not, I don't know if I would say that remediation is always passive. And that's, I mean, that's my perspective. I don't always see it as a passive.
I think that's a good catch, Robin, because I really, like, we do RTI, embedded RTI.
Right.
And it's not passive. Yeah.
I certainly think that if I were a teacher who worked with remediation, Title I teachers, that might bother me.
Okay, so definitely I need to draw that out or adjust.
Yeah.
Good point there. Anyone else?
Maybe adjusting it to say something like sometimes passive, or taking that whole passive out. But when you look at your other side, the goal is for students to learn on time with their peers. Maybe it's more pointing out that typically with remediation, you're pulling kids out of current learning to work on catching them up. And I don't know what the best way to sum that up in a short couple words, but instead of pulling them out of the current education to try to work on getting them caught up with everybody, which tends to just keep them behind everybody, you're trying to interject that into the current learning. So I don't know, I don't have the words, but maybe that it's better.
Yeah, I agree. I'm just, you know, my thought was that word passive is because a lot of teachers put a lot of work into that. And for it to kind of look like it's worksheets and just software programs is not something that I think I would put on a slide.
I think it reminds me more of when we used to just give kids a little work packet and put them off there to work, and we don't want to portray that for sure. So no, thank you for that. And the example that came to mind was, I remember, like, as many of you, we were deep into discussions and trying to figure out learning loss. And while at the same time the task force were working, right, we were kind of on track for the same thing. And so ideas were being shared out. And I just remember regionally, it was like, oh, well, what about, like, what if we just spent the first, quarter just kind of catching everyone up? And then it was like light bulbs going off. Like, if we do that, then we've put all these students a full fourth of a year behind again. And that's how this achievement gap keeps growing and getting bigger. Instead of that, I don't know, one of you said this, that just-in-time learning. I'm getting ready to do long division, but this was a piece I should have gotten in third grade for that. So let's tuck it in right there and really consider, we just had to change our whole daily schedule because we needed to be able to include tier 1 and tier 2 instruction within the school day for all of our students, no matter where they were. So, thank you for those ideas. Anything else that you catch?
I might suggest too that on the last boxes down there, if you focused in on just the goal on both sides and not worry about the process, so you're not limiting the process to get to the goal, I think would be clear and would be a little less abrasive for some individuals.
And I did want to say that when, of course, SMCA works with districts and we provided a lot of free training. And one of the things that we emphasized to all of our members was they only get 4th grade once. They only get 5th grade once. You can't spend time going back and picking up a bunch of 3rd grade skills, you have to start with your 4th grade curriculum and fill in those gaps that may have occurred during that 4-month, 3-month span of time.
Mhm.
So, I mean, that may be just something that you could think about as well. Because that really made teachers stop and think about that, about really how they were thinking about approaching the new school year.
Absolutely. Thank you. Heidi?
I wanted to add something too in the last box of the acceleration, because we have active and fast-paced, hands-on, but the word fast-paced is the one that is kind of like, if we can add like when we need to reteach, we need to see how the students are, because in the fast-paced part, it feels that, okay, we are in this accelerated mode, so we need to go as quickly as we can. But I believe that if we just can add a little bit and use reteaching when needed or adjust to students' needs, it will be clearer, I think, in that piece of fast-paced.
And I'm almost wondering about, Oscar, your idea of would it be clearer if we just put the goals?
I think you could have those other things as talking points as you reference it, maybe, but not have that on the screen, and then you're able to say, so many times including active, fast-paced, hands-on type learning, as opposed to sometimes passive activities like worksheets and, not pulling kids out of class, but keeping them in class while they're learning. So that could be kind of your talking points, but not what you put in the display, I guess.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So Lisa, if you think that's good, I see you're editing as we go. And I always I kind of smile. The Learning in the Fast Lane, that book was so helpful to our task force team, but I did put it adapted from, because I know we take our learning, I think, has helped us like make more sense of this, if that makes sense. So all of your suggestions are very helpful there. Great. All right. So then really that next slide is really just kind of wrapping this back up, just remembering, as we've learned more about acceleration of learning, it was really to address the learning loss that we resulted from last spring. And just, we were here one day, we were closed the next, and then just disruptions. I thought, okay, raise your hand if anybody had to be quarantined once, twice, right? So all of that happening. And then as districts were focusing on connectivity, how do we get hotspots? How do we get those hotspots to our learners? How does that work? And then variability in the opportunities to learn, where some families were, wanting to be up at the school and pick up things, and other families were struggling with that. So that's why this acceleration piece was so important.
Debbie, by the way, can you go back that slide again? When you mention that issues with connectivity, that needs to be pointed out that this is still a big concern throughout the state, because we still have a lot of areas where hotspots don't even work. And so we have homes of our students who cannot get access, and the providers that provided free services for students and things like that, none of them provide service in the areas I'm talking about up here. And I know we're not the only school district, it's throughout the state, but with something like one person for every 4.3 square miles in our big geographical area that we cover, there's not an incentive for those companies to expand, because it's not going to be profitable for them. And so we have a lot of things, a lot of momentum going now with funding for those kind of things. But right now it's still an issue. And so that still needs to continue to be addressed.
No, I made a note of that. Thank you.
So then when we would turn our attention to the recommendations for DESE, and here's where to kind of address the earlier conversation. I think what we'll do is add right at the top that the recommendation, one of the recommendations out of the group was to suspend the statewide assessments for a second year in the going through the spring of 21, or to remove the accountability from their use. Also, among the other numerous, I mean, we had dozens of different recommendations for the department. What we could do to support districts was provide non-accountability assessments, informative tools, to offer professional development on some of the key topics that we've outlined, create mechanisms for sharing resources between and among educators, and in our programming and policy making, emphasize physical needs of our students and the social and emotional needs of our students. And then to continue to foster collaboration on all of these topics by adding newly developed resources and expanding opportunities for sharing. And one of those opportunities was really creating this ongoing collaborative and discussion group.
I think that should be emphasized a lot more. The collaboration piece was the biggest piece I think that came out of this. In my neck of the woods in St. Louis, the charter schools and SLPS collaborated on dates when they would possibly open their schools, how to feed families, how to, get information to families. So I think that was one of the biggest pieces that came out of this, at least what I saw. And also just making sure that, we understand that even though it was, we feel like we were in crisis mode and we were crisis teaching, there are some things we can pull from that, right? And possibly keep and continue to use. So not to lose sight of it and just to say, well, that happened, let's move on and continue to do what we were doing, but to use some of those things as like the collaboration, or even if it's remote teaching of a particular class that only one district has that the other district can't afford. So I think that needs to be emphasized. And the social and emotional learning. The fact that this was a health crisis and a lot of schools do not have nurses, it's baffling to me that wasn't like the biggest thing that the state said, we need to get nurses to these schools so we can open them up. So, that tackle with the social emotional piece of having even a counselor at a school. Those go, that stuff isn't seen in budgets, in a lot of school budgets, because it's too expensive. And so collaborating with districts that have this and could possibly share resources to smaller districts is a big piece. And I think that it just needs to be emphasized that collaboration is huge and we all need to be able to work together, because I just never understood that we did not have a whole separate group talking about how we're going to get nurses to these schools. It just baffled me, but nurses and counselors are definitely needed. So I just wanted to chime in there.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think we've been involved in some conversations and that some of that came up around vaccinators. And that sort of came to the surface for a lot of folks who were looking at this. Really, there's not all schools have nurses. And Shanika, I think a lot of folks were surprised by that.
I might jump in too and give you a shout out for your custodial staff. I met this last week with, we do a summer custodial training every year. Got to hand out certificates and stuff for those completers. But the thing that impressed me was their stories about this last year, how they had to sanitize after every single group of students on top of all their normal duties that, to keep a building clean. So I agree with you. as far as the health individuals. But I tell you, those custodials and support staff really had a tough year this year.
Thank you, Oscar. We also want to share, if we move to the next slide, resources that address around teaching and learning. We'll share with our audience a little bit about the MOLE blocks. So these are designed as collections of rich stimulus material along with activities and some assessment pieces that are designed to be used at the local level. They're flexible. They can be broken apart and be used to help supplement local curricula, local instruction, to create lessons that and become part of a unit. And these are free resources that were provided for educators, and they're available through the DESE website. And if we click through to the next slide, we can see where to find those MOLE blocks in science, in social studies and math and English language arts. And we also have some cross-content integration. We'll see some science and ELA standards that appear in combined in some of our blocks. We'll see some English language arts and social studies combined in some of our blocks, and then we'll see some mathematics and science also combined in some of those blocks. All of this is to help provide resources that can be used virtually, that can be used in the classroom, and that also hit at the important pieces of acceleration, which is getting standards aligned and grade appropriate content materials and in the hands of our students. And then some other things that.
Hey, Lisa,
Roblin.
It's Roblin. Yeah, I just wanted to say that those MOLE blocks, they are amazing. They're a wonderful resource, and if districts would take the time to really get in and look at how useful some of those could be, I see some amazing avenues for acceleration for learning for kids. Especially some of them are so integrated so well. ELA mixing with science and social studies, and then those math MOLE blocks, they provide a way for teachers to really see, where are my kids at the beginning of my unit? Where are they? What have they lost? What have they, where are they? And that gives the teacher the ability to figure out a path for every student that they have. So I can't emphasize enough. Thanks for those. Thanks to the curriculum staff and the Missouri writers, the Missouri teachers that worked on those.
Thank you, Roblin. That's good to hear. We'll pass along. I think we have a couple of our curriculum folks who were involved in guiding that development. And I'm sure they'll carry that message back to the educators. And thank you for bringing that up. I mean, along the way, we've had folks in the educational system all the way, all throughout a variety of roles. So stakeholders who may not work in schools, and educators, administrators, classroom teachers, coaches, folks who work in like Roblin does in the curriculum associations, and in the various groups who have supported the development of resources and information and helped share these materials. So it's really been an educational community effort for sure. So in addition to thinking about how to continue supporting learning acceleration throughout the year and then into this summer and beyond, we continue out of College and Career Readiness, our professional learning series, through virtual workshops. So those happened last summer They happened through this last year. We were able to reach our educators through this kind of web meeting format. And we've set up office hours to talk about specific topics, so kind of drop-in sessions where we would not have a particular program plan, but we would have an opportunity for educators to come together to discuss how they're using various materials, and with our curriculum and assessment directors here at DESE provide answers to questions about some hot topics. And one of those has been the recently released priority standards. Our PLS content is designed to look at subject-specific information and also provide opportunities for learning about cross-content integration. We try to be responsive to the needs of the educators. Most of this is designed really for classroom teachers and coaches. And we're trying to, the goal of this is to provide resources to assist them with implementing the Missouri Learning Standards and the recently identified priority standards. In addition, we've already talked about the ongoing collaboration and this opportunity through this venue to talk about it. I mentioned the Missouri Priority Standards as a resource. And then moving forward, we have pulled together a small group of stakeholders, and Debbie's one of them, to help create a summer learning and engagement work group that's going to leverage the resources that have been provided out of a national convening and a national effort, and help spread that information and also capture discussion about how best to plan for summer learning next year. So if we move on, I promised that we talk a little bit about priority standards, and I think Debbie's gonna jump in here, right?
Yeah, so as we worked, I was on this particular task force, and probably along with a couple of you as well, but this idea of wanting to be sure that we update everyone on the work of the priority standards that the state has done, and just some understanding around that. Because I know as a task force group, we were pretty passionate that so much of the power in these priority standards comes from the teachers wrestling with them. But on the other hand, we also realize that not everyone has the resources to do that. And there was just so much to cover. When we say assessing student academic loss, where do we begin when there's so many non-negotiables? So what standards really carried the most weight? So as we look at this is the basic definition. When we talk about priority standards, or those that have been identified as the most essential to a particular grade level or content or a course. So we really just talk about it as, what are we going to guarantee? I think Roblin said this: you only get fourth grade once, you only get English 1 once, hopefully, right? So what are those non-negotiables that we say before these students leave this classroom, before they leave this course, they will have mastered these standards? So that's the idea behind priority standards. There's a lot of research out there of how to select them. And the state did that along with a lot of support and a collaboration from many across the state for that. But as you notice, the second part of this paragraph, those priority standards are the key ones, but it's really, really important that we know that the other standards are still taught. They're just the supporting standards as we move forward. So this slide are really just some key bullet points from the DESE webpage on priority standards. So I'll give you a moment to read through those, and we'll talk about a couple key pieces. So when we think about the priority standards, there, as that first line says, they're that solid framework on what specific in teaching and learning needs to occur within the grade level, without the courses. So it's really to identify how the students, or what the students need to learn, not how they learn it. And I've always thought in education, it truly is, when you think of Marzano's work on the art and science of teaching, teaching really is an art and a science. So we've got this science behind how do we select the standards that are key and critical to the students. But then the second and the third bullet really address this idea of the art of teaching, when the teacher is going to know when to pace these and when to address them during that school year. But it's the idea that these are the priorities, the non-negotiable. We're going to put those supporting standards in underneath that to create this big picture of what the school year looks like for that grade level or content area or the course. And then I think that last one is this idea of giving teachers the ability to know how to teach those. And a lot that we hear in districts is this new idea of spiraling content. Instead of just saying it's going to be taught, this standard is going to be taught once, we expect everybody to master it, keep it, retain it for the year. It's supporting those students' understandings throughout the school year on these key things, which then will allow for this vertical alignment between the grade levels. If sixth grade knows these are the priority standards that their students are going to go leave them with, then the seventh grade teachers have the ability to know that as well. So just those key pieces as we consider priority standards going forward.
Right, and as we move forward, and we'll share here information about priority standards, we'll point out that in science, we have three-dimensional standards that are modeled after the next generation science standards. And so those come to us by the nature of their development pre-prioritized. So in a sense, all of our science standards are priority standards. In the other three subjects, we'd emphasize that the priority standards, they're not new standards. They're a subset of the Missouri Learning Standards. And we emphasize the importance of teaching not just the priority standards, but all the standards. And as Debbie said, it's really important for educators and students to understand the relationship between and among those supporting standards and the priority standards, and how the content influences from subject to subject and grade to grade. We also want to point out that and to highlight the idea that the process of working with the information, working with the standards, looking at student work, and discussing how students perform on the priority standards, on the supporting standards, and those conversations that happen between educators at the local level is the key to success of this work. So while Missouri has released this set of priority standards, it doesn't mean that they are better than any locally identified priority standards. It's simply a resource for educators and districts to use. And we hope it will be something that those districts who don't have the resources or the size to pull their educators together and take on a project like this, we hope that that these Missouri priority standards will be useful and beneficial for them in helping with acceleration of learning. And if we kind of move on, we can just to reflect back on sort of this process and a few things. We'll see priority standards show up here in several of these lines, but releasing resources for instruction and also social and emotional learning resources and materials for educators, for students, and parents and families. And then launching this collaborative, and then the process. You'll see the process to kind of complete the priority standards that in December, the State Board of Education did vote to take those the accountability away from our statewide assessments this year for both state and federal purposes. And then fast forwarding to last month, this national convening on summer learning and enrichment that we were able to join with a small group. And the pieces, and if we'll kind of flip forward, there's one of the pieces that came out of this, one of the resources was a summer learning toolkit, which we've linked here, and we'll kind of unpack maybe a few of the pieces that might be relevant to our audience tomorrow. But the key takeaways from this national convening, this collaborative, is that to really consider where your educators and where your students are as you go into summer and come out of summer. There were varied kinds of disruption in the school year this past year, from district to district and building to building and family to family. So we had a lot of educators and a lot of students who may have come out of the school year with fatigue. And so that was a big piece that came out of this national convening on summer learning and enrichment, was to consider those things, to do your best to make any summer activities for students, summer school for students and for faculty, consider doing things that are fun, while also attending to standards based learning, but trying to think of a way to ease folks back in, particularly in districts where virtual learning had been taking place for most of the year. And also considering, as I said, the variety of circumstances from district to district. Another key takeaway was really looking at what community partnerships that might already exist in your district, or those partnerships that you could build on or create, and to think forward. So even when this collaborative came together last month, it was already too late, right? That most districts had their plans in place for this summer. So another piece that came out of that was think about how can we plan for next summer. And we hope that the year that we're going into, the school year that we're going into, will feel more like a typical school year, but we also know that it's going to be different from a typical school year. As we said, we are learning in the post-COVID era. So we're going to move forward now.
And I think the only thing I would add is that all of us in this group and everyone in the group that Lisa and I will get the opportunity to share with tomorrow, everybody's in different places. But taking that time to realize and taking time to have the collaborative conversations of what did we learn from this past year that we need to carry forward. I mean, we learned some things that were like, this is so much better for students and for staff as we move forward. So I think having those conversations is so important. And that idea of dreaming ahead, when the national convening happened, we already had summer planned and we were ready to roll it out. But that doesn't mean that we can't start now with the collaborative group dreaming of next summer and continuing to make the process better for our students and our staff as we move forward. So as we wrap this piece, tomorrow we'll have them share what's a resource or something that you're thinking that you'd like to take back and share with your district. So I'm just going to ask you a minute to say, like, as you think back, what Lisa and I have shared, what would be one takeaway you think that the team might have tomorrow?
I hope it's an understanding of togetherness, or the spirit of collaborating, because like you said, there have been many groups that have come together from all different walks of this education spectrum and have talked about some of the hardships that they had and really opened the eyes of a lot of people. I can say that I took back to my group a lot of the charter school authorizers and the charter school leadership that, you know, hey, we have some things that others do not have. And I talked a lot about the connectivity and being able to teach remotely, and that every place in the state is not able to do that. I also talked to them, you know, it's just having that understanding that there are people who are collaborating, that are talking, and I think that we should continue that. But I hope that's a takeaway for them to see that and to know that, you know, we're all in the same boat.
Yes, thank you for that.
Yes.
Anyone else? Right, then from
So-
there, we're really going to open it up to questions and anything that may want to learn from Lisa and I, right?
So I did want to mention that that again, the priority standards and the MOLIC blocks that came out of the work that was done by both DESE and you know, mentioned by the task force members, I think has been some of the most useful work that districts can utilize, not just could have used, but now will continue to be able to use. So the thought behind all of that is just a piece that I think is really important.
Thank you.
All right, I want to say thank you to Debbie and Lisa for sharing this presentation with us today and bringing us up to date on what's going on. And these are their email addresses if you'd like to contact them with further questions or suggestions or comments. And you can also put things on the note taker if you'd like, and I can pass those along and share them. And I wanted to make sure we know that our repository is still available, and I did add some sections for resources within regions. So if you want to pop on there and add any resources in your region that you think might be helpful to teachers or school districts around you, there is a page specific to each region, and you can collaborate and use and share those as you wish. So take a look at those and see if the categories I added are appropriate, or if there's anything that needs added or eliminated or combined. So that is available. And Lisa, that might be something also that you can add when you discuss the Learning Acceleration Collaborative, that we do have that resource available.
Okay.
And then since we only have 13 people that came today, and five of us were DESE, maybe we will go ahead and cancel our July meeting and have our next one in August and do updates on what's happened in July, if that's okay with everyone. And I'm looking at August 9th. I'll send out a questionnaire and see if that's a good date for everyone, and I'll let you get back with me on that. And we had said that we maybe will not do every month going forward into the new year. So if you want to put suggestions about that in the note taker, or if you have suggestions on that now, I'm happy to entertain those as well. And then that's it. You can always contact me, and the resources for our web page and the hub are there at the bottom of the page as well. And that concludes our meeting for today. Thank you all for taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate all the work you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
All right.
Thanks all.
Enjoy your summer.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Heidi.
Have a great summer.
You too.
Thanks.